Greetings, Culture Warriors. This is Jeff Vieira, author of Culture is Everything, and your host for this Dispatches from the Front podcast, where we go into depth on some business stories, applying the filter of what it means from a company culture perspective. You know, kick off a lot of these podcasts, I often say, well, I got something different for you today. It's almost ridiculous to keep saying that, so I think I'll stop. But today I want to switch to the world of music to discuss some values that you can glean from stories from the music business. I have been a lifelong blues fan. Long ago, when I was in junior high school, I started listening to blues music. My love for it only intensified over the intervening years. It initially started because I had seen 1980's The Blues Brothers movie with Jake and Elwood and a lot of top blues talent whose careers had kind of gone into eclipse by that point. So where else are you going to find in a movie like that people like Ray Charles, John Lee Hooker, soul artists like Aretha Franklin, even Cab Calloway, who got his start back in the Cotton Club in Harlem as a band leader, and who basically invented scat vocals. So after getting exposed to those folks within the movie, which was really more of a musical, I started picking up their albums, going back quite a ways in the history to really dig deep into their catalogs. Unfortunately, I happen to live at a time when new ways of recording music, new media, were coming out fairly frequently, so these catalogs were getting refreshed. You didn't have to have everything on 45 or 78 anymore. You could have it on cassette. You could have it on CD. And eventually, you could get it digitally through iTunes and other purveyors of audio files. So I've had a lifelong love affair with the blues. I've gotten a chance to see a number of terrific blues artists before they passed. This story today comes through one of those blues artists, the great Buddy Guy, Chicago blues guitarist, originally from Louisiana, now owns a building in Chicago, still tours, has his own club called Buddy Guy's Legends there in Chicago, and a beloved senior statesman of the blues. I got a chance to see Buddy in Charlotte a few years ago, and I happened to be in the second row and got to have a little interaction with him during the show. It was the thrill of a lifetime. The man is simply amazing and still putting on a show that few can top, even as he is now in his 80s. So the story today is about another blues artist. I think it's safe to call him that. He does perform in other genres, but obviously blues is near and dear to his heart. He has an album out of blues covers, and his name is Peter Frampton. Now, you may remember Frampton from his legendary album, Frampton Comes Alive. I think that was about 1976 or so. And he really dominated the late 70s in a way few artists have. Once he left his original group, Humble Pie, and struck out as a solo artist. Humble Pie, like a lot of British acts of the time, relied a lot upon the blues. And so Frampton naturally developed a love for the blues that a lot of British rock and roll stars had. That was just something very typical of their generation. In a lot of ways, we owe those British musicians for the fact that we still hear the blues today. And I'll get around to that in a minute. His most recent album, All Blues, quoting from the article here, is a masterpiece and shows Frampton taking the wheel on 10 blues classics, from a beautiful instrumental version of Georgia on My Mind, which Ray Charles, of course, made famous, to B.B. King's The Thrill Is Gone. This album is a must-have. All Blues was recorded with Frampton's longtime touring band made up of Adam Lester, Rob Arthur, Dan Wojcicki. The album was recorded at Frampton's studio in Nashville and was co-produced by Frampton and Chuck Inley. So that should tell you that it's a labor of love. He didn't have to make this album at this time, and he obviously had a hand in everything. And so the interviewer decides to talk with Peter about the album and his interest in the blues. And he asks him, "Do you remember the first time you heard real blues?" "Yes. I saw John Lee Hooker on TV when I was about 11, I guess. He came over to England. So I was about 11 or 12, and he had the hit with Dimples. And that was the first. And then I went to see Sonny Boy Williamson at a local club in South London. Sonny Boy was a great harmonica player. I have no doubt at this point there were actually several Sonny Boy Williamsons. He's probably talking about Sonny Boy Williamson II, not because he was the son of the original. His name was Rice Miller. Great harp player, and he took on the stage name of the original Sonny Boy Williamson. And he went over to England, like a lot of the blues artists did in the 60s, because their music was no longer being heard in this country where it was born, but there was a renewed interest in it overseas because of young musicians like the Rolling Stones, like Frampton. I went to see him a couple times because I thought he was great. So yeah, I loved all that. So that was when I first started listening to the blues. So now moving ahead a bit, you were on the scene too in the late 60s, but were guys like Peter Green and Mick Taylor an influence on you? Did you ever catch them live? Oh yes, I saw Peter Green play with the Blues Breakers. I saw them all play with the Blues Breakers. The Blues Breakers was John Mayall's legendary band. It's still ongoing as far as I know, but he's broken probably more great blues musicians than any other band leader since probably Muddy Waters back in the day. In fact, I just told him that when we did Crossroads. So those ones you mentioned, Mick Taylor, Peter Green, Eric Clapton, Scotty Moore, I loved all their playing at that point, and so did everybody else. That was when you drive around London, and on overpasses and train bridges, you'd see graffiti, and it would say, "Clapton is God." So I just want you to notice his reaction to some of the blues rock greats of his day here. I know Django Reinhardt had a huge impact on you, and then you took classical guitar lessons too, right? Yes. I love Django Reinhardt stuff, but that kind of came out of left field for you at that time, right? How did you initially get into Django's music? And then he goes on to tell a story about how his parents really got him into listening to Django Reinhardt. Fast forward a little bit here. I stayed in the room while he played Django Reinhardt, and I suddenly started to smile and go, "Holy crap, this guy's good." And from a very early age, I realized I'll never be able to do this, but I'm going to give it a good try. And then he goes on to talk about a mentor of his. The person that was my mentor to start me off was Hank Marvin from the Shadows. But at that time, I was listening to the extreme talent and dexterity of Django Reinhardt flying up and down the fingerboard with only 2 fingers working, you know? So I was caught by the jazz bug at the same time. I was caught by the rock bug. Rock, blues, and jazz. They all sort of happened at the same time for me. So they were always, I wasn't one or the other until during The Herd. That was an early band he was in. I was listening to a lot more jazz because everyone was starting to sound like Eric Clapton. And I thought, well, there's already a couple of those guys that are really good. Peter Green, Eric Clapton. I think I'll go the other way. So that's when I changed my listening. to everything to specifically just listening to jazz for a while. So when I got to Humble Pie, that was when I formulated what I call my style, because I had obviously been listening to rock and I'd obviously been listening to blues and listening to jazz. And Humble Pie was an area where I could combine all three and it would work, because Steve Marriott's guitar style was very much a hard edge blues style and mine was heavy rock, but also a more lyrical solo style because of the jazz influence. So that's when I brought it all together. And one day I woke up during the formulation of the first year of Humble Pie and said, I think I sound like me now. And it's a wonderful feeling. So now I'm still listening to all these players, but realizing that I can pull licks from other people, but I'll never play it quite like they do. And what do? You play it like you, and then you change it a little bit, and then it morphs into another part of your library of licks that you keep up with, you know? So it was a very interesting period, the Humble Pie period. All right. So a couple things I want you to know from this conversation, and the reason that I'm going into it with a little bit of depth here is I want you to think about what it means in terms of the values of Frampton and other blues musicians. Because I would argue that Frampton's take here is very typical of blues musicians. And it's a little bit different from other genres of music, because within the blues, you have to understand the history of the music. The blues started out in the Mississippi Delta as entertainment for sharecroppers. So it was first captured on tape during the Depression, when Alan Lomax, with a government grant, went around to capture folk music during the Great Depression. And so he'd go around to all these rural parts of America, and he would record. He had a mobile recording studio. He would record the local artists. And that's when he discovered this thing called the blues. So some of the early blues artists you recognize: Robert Johnson, widely considered to be the father of the blues; Son House, guys like that, Muddy Waters. They began their careers picking cotton by day and then entertaining at fish fries and juke joints by night and on weekends. And they began to develop quite a reputation for themselves as they moved throughout the South. Once the Depression was coming to an end, and we started to see the industrial boom of the 40s, these men, by and large, headed north to Chicago, and in the case of John Lee Hooker in particular, to Detroit, where there was job opportunities. So they could work in the factories, and then they could entertain in the clubs at night. And so the blues moved into its Chicago phase. That was also when it became electric. In the early days, it was a lot of, it was basically all acoustic guitar, some harmonica, maybe some drums, and there wasn't an amplifier in sight. But once they moved to Chicago, that all changed, and you started to see a level of sophistication come into the music, which had not really been present before. It started out rural, it became urban music by the 50s. So then you have Chess Records in the 50s, big Chicago blues label. You may have seen the movie Cadillac Records, which is all about chess. But you start to see this music now become very popular and indeed start to cross over. It had previously been reserved to the race records. Black people had their music, white people had their music, and there wasn't any real crossover between the two. But that all changed in the late 50s and early 60s. And some artists cross over. You saw the birth of rock and roll come out of this. And so you had guys like Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, guys who helped kind of attend the birth of rock and go down that path. and the blues started to die out. Except in England. So England in the post-war period, you had a group of a generation coming up which had different musical tastes than the big band predilection of their parents. And so they started with skiffle and Lonnie Donegan, and then very quickly migrated into an interest in the blues. And so you had these British kids forming these rock bands and mining songs from old blues artists that they had found. It became kind of a cottage industry to go get the latest records from America. People would come over here, raid the cheap pile of records, and go back with classic blues. These kids who were forming bands at the time heard it and started recording their own rendition of it. And as they did so, they really developed an audience over in England for these blues artists. And that's how you wind up with Sonny Boy Williamson taking his harmonica and his bottle of whiskey and going into a club where a guy like Peter Frampton could see him. So all of a sudden, these old blues artists who were really struggling at this point with the changing musical taste in America, they start getting feelers from bands overseas. There's a famous story of the Rolling Stones after they started to break, coming to America, going to Chicago, going to Chess Records, and finding Muddy Waters painting a wall there. And they were knocked out by the fact that Muddy, who was probably the greatest blues man of his generation, certainly the greatest band leader of his generation, no offense, Howlin' Wolf, the Muddy was slopping paint on a wall rather than cutting records and playing clubs, was a shock to the system for Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and the guys. And so that led to bringing a bunch of these blues acts back over to England, where a new generation could fall in love with their music. And so the generosity that you hear in how Frampton talks about what is his competition was very much ingrained in the blues community at this time. Before this, blues could be as cutthroat as anything. Little Walter, who may have been the best harmonica player ever, Little Walter used to get into what he called cutting contests, where he and other harp players on the Chicago scene would try and one-up each other. So they'd jump up with a band and through real virtuoso playing, attempt to just grind the other guy into the ground. And they were competing. Usually you have one harp player in a band. I don't know too many that have more than one. And harp was their only instrument typically. They might sing a little bit. But in the blues bands of the day, you were one and done. So you could only be in one band. And so it was very competitive. And these guys made no bones about getting up and trying to blow the other guy off stage every opportunity that they got. But by the time that initial golden age of the blues had started to subside, the attitude shifted. And now you started seeing more collegiality amongst the blues artists, who were a little bit flummoxed at why all these white kids talking funny had come over from Europe and seemed to know all their music. One of the entrees that many children of my generation got to the blues was through the music of acts like Led Zeppelin, who would do some real blues deep cuts, put their own spin on it, and make it their own. They received a lot of criticism at the time because the notion was, well, you've taken songs from a Muddy Waters and you haven't given him anything in return. People who bring this argument up don't really understand how the business worked during Muddy's day and during the 70s. Because Muddy Waters didn't really make a ton in royalties. You know, most of his money was made in the clubs, in his tours. Those are things that he had more direct control of. Generally speaking, the royalty agreements were Byzantine and didn't favor the artist. And so you would see a lot of these artists, to make ends meet, recording under different names. John Lee Hooker was famous for this. John Lee Hooker has a very unique growling boogie style that once you hear it, you can't unhear it. So when you see somebody with a very different name appearing on another album, you just know it was John Lee Hooker. You can hear it all over it. But for contractual reasons, he had to change his name in order to make money on that cut that was outside his normal record company. And for a prolific artist like Hooker, no one record company was enough. He would crank out songs at a pace that was just unbelievable. And so he needed to put out enough content to feed himself and his family. And so he would perform under a pseudonym to keep the money coming in. That was just how the business operated. And so even if Led Zeppelin had said, Whole Lotta Love is nothing more than You Need Love with a slightly different arrangement, even if they had said that and given Muddy Waters record company credit for that song, Muddy Waters never would have seen a dime. It did nothing for Muddy Waters because that was the way the agreements were. His record company might make a little slug of money. I'm sure they'd appreciate it, but otherwise, you wouldn't benefit the artist. Now, the way you could benefit the artist is by having them open for you, which they did. It was by being seen in public performing with that artist. It was by praising that artist in public. It was by recommending that people get their albums, which they did. That was how you put money in their pocket. That was how you reinvigorated their career. So all of that European tour that had not been open to blues artists previously, that whole option became available because of bands like Led Zeppelin. And don't think that the blues artists didn't appreciate it. They did. So you notice with Frampton talking how clearly he values the love for music, how much he respects other artists to the point where he diminishes his own talent and skills and success to point a finger to theirs. That is also very common within the blues community. And it crosses racial boundaries. For a time in the 80s, as blues was undergoing yet another resurgence, thanks to guys like Stevie Ray Vaughan and Robert Cray, the Fabulous Thunderbirds, there was thinking at the dawn of identity politics that only black people should be able to play the blues because the music was so deeply ingrained in the African American cultural experience and history that it was an insult somehow if a person of a different race tried to play the blues. And it wound up being a failing argument in the end And no wonder, because it was a weak and kind of nasty argument. The appeal of the blues, why it struck at the heart of British teenagers living in London after the war, why it spoke to me, a bricklayer's kid living in New England in the 70s, and so many others, was that the blues was about raw emotion, happiness, joy, deep sadness. It's a music that's not, it's intentionally not complicated, as it typically goes. And you'll hear blues artists urging players who may be technically proficient to play with more feeling. For this reason, the blues is geared towards gaining an emotional reaction from the audience. I mean, it started out in juke joints with exhausted people having their one outlet for the week. You know, on those hot summer nights in Mississippi. That is not a uniquely black experience. People of all races have emotions deeply held. Everyone has had to deal with setbacks and suffering, the loss of someone you love. And the blues speaks to everyone for that reason. And so you'll see a value that's cropped up within lovers of the blues, where, in the words of Buddy Guy, it's only skin deep. Meaning that that's about as deep a significance as the color of your skin goes. And that's how a kid like Paul Butterfield, another candidate for best harp player of all time, could, in the 60s, front what may have been the best blues band of its day, even though he was just a scruffy white kid from the south side of Chicago. You know, he grew up living the blues. And so as we take a look at how guys like Peter Frampton and the like express their reverence for the music that they love and the people who brought it about, the musicians who made it happen, we get a glimpse into some cultural values that we may not have seen at the forefront previously. Good values, values that have stood the test of time and made it possible for contemporary artists like Gary Clark Jr., Samantha Fish, great talented artists, to continue on the legacy of the blues. There's no sign of that stopping. Other genres have come and gone. You know, you don't see many skiffle acts these days. Disco has not had quite the comeback that the blues has had. But we keep coming back around to this particular music. Always with a bit of an update, but yet retaining the heart. And I think that has everything to do with the culture it has engendered. Because musical tastes change, but culture is everything. Thank you. Have a great day.